Good evening. I wanted to work with you a little bit tonight on your research, and I apologize for not getting this to you sooner, but I want to spend some time reviewing some steps about your research and some the elements of counterargument and concession. So this research paper you're doing on racial profiling, I know it's a bit tough in some ways to wrap your brain around, and maybe it's easy to just to focus on summarizing cases, and I want you to use cases but in a specific way. So you do want to kind of consider things like, why does racial profiling happen? How is it, or how and why is it so dangerous? And how can we decrease it? Now, you can't do all of those things in a research paper of this length. You can do some of them. And so we're going to give you some ideas in this discussion about what to do. This picture, by the way, is after Trayvon Martin was killed, one of the U.S. senators, Bobby Rush, was giving his statement about a gun control bill in Florida, and during that time put up his hoodie, and he was removed from the floor during that. They saw it as an act of defiance. Four other senators did the same in showing their support of Trayvon Martin. So types of racial profiling. So I want you to think about this broadly. You might have focused on one case, and you're not stuck with that case if you want to change your mind, but you can focus on specific kinds of racial profiling. So like in New York City, they have the stop and frisk issue because it's a different law there in the city of New York, where people can get profiled just walking down the neighborhood, down the street. There's huge stats that show that overwhelmingly the number of people profiled and pulled over are African American or Mexican American, and primarily between the ages of 12 and 25 or 30. And it has an impact and both positive and negative, and a lot of it negative. So anyway, that's one type, but it doesn't have to be New York City. It could be anywhere. Also, specifically around the U.S. border, around for immigration issues. So there's been these laws passed in Arizona and Georgia that allow cops, not just INS, but any cop, to pull someone over because they think they might be illegal and to make them show papers. So if you think about that, like because you're driving down the road and you're brown, the cops legally in those two states can pull you over and ask for your papers at any time. And there's been cases of people who didn't have them and who were held in custody. One woman pregnant and gave birth in jail because she didn't have her papers, and it was a pretty brutal case. Also, the driving issue, driving while black or brown. There's a big case out of North Carolina. You can find it in the New York Times, Greensboro, North Carolina. There was a big study done about African Americans and the rates in which they were pulled over versus the rates in which they found drugs, much higher in whites compared to African Americans, yet African Americans were pulled over way more often. So that's sort of an interesting case there that you could look at, or an area. Another one is airports. I'm going to use the airports and terrorism for my talk here, but you can still use that one, especially if you have friends or family or know anyone who deals with issues of being Muslim, or perceived as Muslim, because we'll know that a lot of Sikh Indians are also sometimes mistaken as Muslim. Also in stores while shopping. So this happens a lot. It's not police necessarily, the police are sometimes called, but it could just be store employees and other groups who profile based on shopping, assuming that you're either going to steal or don't have the money to pay for something or have stolen. And then the last one, which I find the most interesting in some ways and kind of the most disturbing, is that at high schools across the nation, there are 16 million students who go to school at a high school that does not have a high school counselor but does have a cop. And so if you think about that a little bit, it's pretty disturbing. These cops are called resource officers, and what's hard about them is they have way less training than a regular cop, but they still have a weapon. And they've found statistic-wise that when these resource officers are used on high conflict campuses, they increase the likelihood of young people going to prison rather than finishing school. So it's something to consider, and there's a lot of cases for these. So the prompt here, which we've seen, you want to research one aspect of racial profiling, look into the origins, causes, legalities, and or ethics and consequences. You might want to use a case or two to analyze, to kind of look at the case and kind of what it brings out. So your prompt or your paper might focus on, police training, Is it being too militarized? Does that change the perspective? Is there, if someone has PTSD from serving in the military, should they really be serving in the police force in a high conflict area, based on their training? Something to consider. Also, with police, whether they have crisis intervention training, I assumed it was all required, but it's voluntary. So that tells you something else too. But some other things, like what about implicit bias, where it is just, we've learned it and it's in us, and we have a hard time moving away from it. So there's some articles I can give you on that, and there's a variety of things you can look at depending upon which topic. Okay, so you need to read Chapter 9. Chapter 9, by the way, just focuses on solutions to overcoming stereotype threat. So this would be ways that might be in your solution section of your paper. They're theories, but you could apply them to the racial profiling with police use of force. But chapters 5 through 8 in Whistling Vivaldi also have these really good relevant theories for why profiling occurs and how it impacts people. They talk about over-efforting and John Henryism. There's this section about how people don't realize they're stressed and having stereotype threat issues, but they actually are, and they looked at their heart rates, and that they misdirect the feelings they're having. So they might confuse a feeling of excitement with attraction, or they might confuse a feeling of nervousness with something else, which tells us that a lot of times if cops see someone and they're nervous, they might mistake that for something else, like guilt, rather than just nerves because they don't know what to do. I mean, I've been pulled over before driving, and it's a nerve-wracking experience. And so when it's happening, your adrenaline's running, and things can be perceived incorrectly, like that actor observer perspective. Also, on the site, you'll see that there's 2 websites and a newspaper article. I really suggest reading those and looking over them, getting a sense of some other cases, and understanding a lot of different perspectives. Finally, you want to use 5 to 6 resources that you find using the research database. Now, it doesn't have to all be from there. You can use chapters of books, ebooks. You could use a little bit of interview if you find an interview with a cop or a lawyer or someone who's gone through this kind of profiling. You can also do online databases, and I'm going to give you a list of those at the end of this talk. So what's concession? I want either a concession and or a counter argument. It'd be great if you could do both. A concession technically means to give away. You think of a concession stand, and you have to pay for the food, but you sort of have food or things given away. To concede means to offer up something. And you typically are offering a merit of the opposition's point of view. You're saying, well, they're right in this way. What's really nice about doing this is it increases your credibility with your opposition. They think, you're on their side a little bit, or you at least understand them. And it kind of helps you feel like it makes you look as if, even if you haven't fully, but normally you have, that you've understood both sides, you've read it, you're not ignoring anything. So you don't want to concede like the main point you're trying to make is wrong, but you want to kind of show the other side's merit. So that's sort of what we want to focus on. When you do that, you're going to use a dependent clause structure, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. So here's an idea. So here's one concession. Even though terrorist attacks on airplanes can carry a large death toll and are therefore attractive targets for terrorists. So that's conceding for those people who think it's okay to racially profile in airports. So I'm saying yes, and using that even though contrasting dependent clause word and putting the concession at the beginning. Then I say in the main clause, they are not common events. So I'm agreeing with them on one hand, but I'm also showing where I don't think it's quite accurate. It's not very common. Second example, it is true that, it's a really good phrase to use, many recent terrorist attacks have been associated with Islamic extremists. However, the majority of Muslims are peace-loving citizens, so racially profiling them is not efficient. So this is a different way of setting it up, but it also has a semicolon with 2 complete sentences and a contrasting transition word, however. So those are 2 ideas, and think about the structure of your concession that you could use. Okay, counter argument. I'm using the World Trade Center sort of things because we're talking about terrorism on mine. But some benefits. If you use counter argument, it helps with your ethos. So if you remember that pathos, ethos, logos, ethos is the ethics, your credibility as an author or writer or speaker. So how your readers feel about you is really important, and it makes you appear balanced if you offer a counter argument. And it also helps your detractors deal with the objections that you anticipate. So you kind of know ahead of time, they know ahead of time, oh, that she understands this point and she's going to address it. So how you do a counter argument, you turn against your argument to challenge it, and then you turn back to reaffirm it. Okay, so that's how you do it. So you include one or more disadvantage or a practical drawback to what you propose. So you kind of show your weakness. Okay, this is different than offering the merit of the opposition. This is where you're showing your weakness. And then you give an alternative explanation or proposal that makes more sense. So you kind of show a weakness, then re-explain it and go back to why you agree. So the first stage is turn against. So you might say, we can draw a different conclusion from this. This term that they're using is maybe it is unfair. Certain evidence has been ignored or played down. You want to start using this phrase, it might seem like, or it's true that, or admittedly. So it sounds a little bit like a concession at the beginning. You're turning away from your argument. And then you want to give an alternative explanation or proposal. But how? But what about this? And you want to offer a new packaged version of a proposal that seems more clear, or that's more convincing. The second stage is you turn back. You return to your own argument using that but, yet, however, and you refute it. Why is it mistaken? An apparent problem but not a real problem. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to acknowledge its validity. Back on your own argument, why it's important, and concede its force. Restate your thesis in a more exact way. So where do you put it? You can put it anywhere. You can put it in part of your introduction before your thesis. You can put it in a section or paragraph just after your intro because you want to deal with the counter argument right away. You might also just make a little quick move of a counter argument in your body paragraph or just before the conclusion. But try to use it sparingly. If you do counter arguments throughout, it could get a little exhausting in a paper, and it can make you feel like you're dealing with a lot of side issues instead of your main point you're trying to prove. So here's an example. If I said, behavioral profiling has proven effective for identifying suspected terrorists, that's my claim. So my first counter argument to that, say, it may be tempting then to combine ethnic and behavioral profiling at airports. Okay, so if behavioral profiling, how someone's acting, is effective for identifying terrorists, it might be tempting to look at their behavior and their ethnicity. And so then I'm going to turn back on that and say, however, research proves that it's not necessary to use ethnic profiling. In fact, since terrorists often don't have criminal records and know they may be profiled, they tend to go to great lengths to alter their physical appearance. And so I'm turning back on that counter argument. And so those are the two steps. Finally, I want to talk about research databases. If you go to the Foothill Library website, there's some options here. You can click on books or ebooks in the catalog and look up, you don't have to read a whole book. You might find a chapter on something that works for you. Databases, Academic Search Premier is a great database to start with. It's very general. You can narrow it by date, type of periodical. You can narrow it by subject, and it gives you suggested subjects. There's also a site under databases called Opposing Viewpoints. That gives you the pros and cons on a site. It gives you good summaries of the issues at hand, especially if you're not sure about your topic. And then just as a note, so U.S. police departments nor the government have been using or tracking police shootings in a systematic way. And so until just recently they started this, and so there's a couple of websites which I posted on the main page that have been doing this a little longer than the police, and they're considered pretty solid. I've talked to even law enforcement about it, and they said, yeah, it's considered, sorry, my dog's gone, considered pretty solid research. So it's something to consider. So good luck, and I'm excited about seeing your papers, and I hope this is helpful.